Dr. Holden, I presume? The voice was deep, with a faint metallic edge, like a tuning fork struck against stone. Elliot Holden froze mid-step, the grocery bag in his hand, threatening to spill its contents onto the cracked pavement. The man, or whatever he was, stood in the shadow of a street lamp, his face obscured by a hood that seemed to shimmer unnaturally under the dim light. "You've got the wrong person," Elliot replied, though his voice betrayed a tremor. He hadn't been called doctor in years, not since he'd walked away from the world of research. "Your modesty is misplaced," the figure said, stepping closer. His features came into view, sharp, too symmetrical, and with eyes that glowed faintly silver. "Not human. We know what you've done, and what you've hidden." Elliot tightened his grip on the bag, his mind racing. "I don't know what you're talking about." The figure tilted his head, as if amused. "Denial is futile. You're the only one who can unlock the device." Elliot's breath caught. The device. He had buried the memories of those blueprints deep, but the mention of it brought them rushing back like a dam bursting. A project he thought was forgotten, abandoned after a disastrous fallout. "I destroyed everything," Elliot said, his voice a whisper. "Not everything," the alien replied, his glowing eyes narrowing. "The key exists, and if you don't help us retrieve it, someone far less reasonable will." Elliot took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. "I don't work on that kind of thing anymore. I'm retired. I'm human," the alien interrupted, the word rolling off his tongue like an observation rather than an insult. "But also responsible. You created the foundation for something that could alter the fate of this planet and beyond. Retirement doesn't absolve you of that." Elliot's mind scrambled for an escape, but the alien's presence felt like a weight pinning him in place. "And what exactly do you want with it? To save the world or destroy it?" The alien's lips curved into a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "That depends entirely on who holds the key. If it falls into the wrong hands, your kind won't live to regret it." Elliot's fingers twitched. "And your hands? Are they the right ones?" The alien didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his cloak and pulled out a small, glowing orb. It pulsed faintly, emitting a low hum that seemed to resonate with the air around them. "This is what remains of my people's wisdom. We used it to guide us, to heal us. But without the key, it's incomplete. Broken." Elliot's gaze was drawn to the orb, a mix of curiosity and dread. "What does this have to do with me?" "You designed the interface," the alien said simply. "You're the only one who can repair it." Elliot shook his head. "That was decades ago. I barely remember the schematics, let alone how to—" "You'll remember," the alien interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Because you must." Elliot felt the weight of the words settle over him. He had spent years trying to forget, to leave behind the guilt and the consequences of his work. But now, it seemed, the past wasn't content to stay buried. "And if I refuse?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. The alien's smile vanished. "You won't." The next morning, Elliot found himself staring at his cluttered desk, the alien's orb sitting in the center like a silent accusation. He hadn't slept. The encounter replayed in his mind on an endless loop, and every time he thought about walking away, a nagging voice reminded him of the stakes. The orb flickered, its glow dimming and brightening in an almost rhythmic pattern. It wasn't just a device. It felt alive, as though it were waiting for him to act. Elliot sighed and reached for his old notebook. The pages were yellowed, filled with sketches and equations that had once seemed so promising. He flipped through them, his fingers brushing against the edges of a folded blueprint tucked into the back. Unfolding it, he stared at the design he had sworn never to look at again. The key. It had been a theoretical concept back then, a way to manipulate biological and molecular structures on a scale that could heal or harm. The potential had been limitless and dangerous. Elliot had walked away before it could be weaponized. But now he wondered if that decision had only delayed the inevitable. The alien's voice echoed in his mind. "You're the only one who can repair it." Elliot set the blueprint down and began to work. 3 days later, the alien returned. This time, he wasn't alone. Elliot opened the door to find two more figures standing beside the first. One was tall and willowy, with skin that shimmered like liquid mercury. The other was shorter, stockier, and covered in scales that glinted like polished stone. "You've been busy," the first alien said, his glowing eyes scanning the cluttered desk behind Elliot. "Not by choice," Elliot muttered, stepping aside to let them in. "Who are your friends?" "Colleagues," the alien replied. "We share a common goal." Elliot raised an eyebrow. "And what goal is that, exactly? Saving the universe, or conquering it?" The scaled alien let out a low growl. "We don't have time for your suspicions, human. The device must be completed before it's too late." "Too late for what?" Elliot asked, his frustration boiling over. "You keep talking about urgency, but you haven't told me what's at stake." The willowy alien stepped forward, her voice soft but firm. The key was not just a tool for healing. It was also a weapon of unimaginable power. If it falls into the hands of the Zorath Collective, they will use it to wipe out entire planets. Including this one. Elliot's stomach churned. He had heard of the Zorath Collective, an empire that expanded through fear and destruction. "And you expect me to believe you're any better?" The first alien placed a hand on Elliot's shoulder, his grip surprisingly gentle. "We are not asking for blind trust, Dr. Holden. Only for your help. The key is your creation. Its fate is tied to yours." Elliot looked at the three aliens, their expressions a mix of urgency and resolve. He didn't trust them, not completely, but he couldn't ignore the weight of their words. The key wasn't just his past. It was his responsibility. "All right," he said finally. "I'll help. But if I find out you're lying to me..." The first alien nodded. "You won't." Elliot's workshop became a hive of activity. The aliens worked alongside him, their advanced technology blending with his old tools in ways he never thought possible. The orb sat at the center of it all, glowing brighter as the pieces of the key began to take shape. The willowy alien, who introduced herself as Lasara, proved invaluable. Her knowledge of molecular structures and bioengineering far surpassed Elliot's, and yet she treated his insights with respect. The scaled alien, Zorath, was less patient, often growling under his breath when progress slowed, but he had a knack for improvisation that rivaled Elliot's own. As for the first alien, who finally gave his name as Kale, he acted as a mediator, keeping the group focused. His calm demeanor hid a sharp intellect, and Elliot found himself grudgingly impressed by his leadership. Days turned into weeks. Elliot barely slept, driven by a mix of fear and determination. The key was more than just a device. It was a puzzle, one that demanded every ounce of his skill and ingenuity. And as the pieces came together, so did the stakes. One night, as Elliot worked on the final component, he paused to look at Lasara. She was studying the orb, her expression unreadable. "Why do you care so much about this?" he asked, breaking the silence. She looked up, her silver eyes shimmering in the dim light. "Because my people didn't. We had the chance to use this technology for good, to heal, to create. But we let fear and greed consume us. The key became a weapon, and it destroyed everything." Elliot frowned. "And now you're trying to undo that?" Lasara nodded. "If we succeed, maybe we can prove that we're more than the mistakes of our past." Her words struck a chord with Elliot. He had spent years running from his own mistakes, but now he realized that redemption wasn't about forgetting. It was about making things right. The night the key was completed, the workshop buzzed with a strange energy. The device was sleek and compact, its surface etched with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and glow under the light. It pulsed faintly, resonating with the orb, as if they were two halves of the same whole. "It's done," Elliot said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "Now what?" Kale stepped forward, his glowing eyes fixed on the device. "Now we ensure it doesn't fall into the wrong hands." Elliot crossed his arms. "And how do you plan to do that? You said the Zorath Collective is after this. What's stopping them from coming here?" "They're already here," Zorath growled, his scales bristling. "We intercepted their signal. They know the key is active." Elliot's stomach dropped. "You're telling me they're on Earth?" Kale nodded. "Which is why we need to move quickly. The key must be taken to a secure location, far from their reach." "And what happens to me?" Elliot asked, his voice rising. I'm the one who built this thing. Won't they come after me too? They will, Lasara admitted. But we won't let them take you. Elliot wasn't reassured. That's not exactly comforting. Before anyone could respond, the workshop lights flickered. A low rumble shook the ground, and the air grew thick with tension. They're here, Zorath said, his voice a low growl. Kale grabbed the key, cradling it like a fragile artifact. We need to leave. Now. Elliot hesitated, his mind racing. He had spent weeks pouring himself into this project, and now it felt like everything was spiraling out of control. But he didn't have time to argue. The rumble grew louder, accompanied by the sound of something massive tearing through the atmosphere. Kale placed a hand on Elliot's shoulder. You've done your part, Dr. Holden. Now let us do ours. The group barely made it out of the workshop before the first blast hit. Elliot stumbled as the shockwave knocked him off balance, his ears ringing from the explosion. He turned to see a massive ship hovering above, its sleek design bristling with weapons. Zorath snarled, his claws extending as he faced the approaching enemy. Lasara activated a small device on her wrist, projecting a shimmering barrier around them. Keep moving, Kale shouted, leading the way toward a hidden transport ship. Elliot followed, his heart pounding. He wasn't built for this kind of chaos. He was a scientist, not a soldier. But as he glanced back at the key in Kale's hands, he realized there was no turning back. The Zorath soldiers descended like shadows, their armor gleaming under the moonlight. They moved with precision, their weapons trained on the group. Zorath roared and charged, his scaled body a blur of motion. Lasara fired a pulse of energy from her wrist device, creating a path through the enemy ranks. Elliot stumbled onto the transport ship, his hands shaking as he strapped himself into a seat. Kale followed, placing the key in a secure compartment before taking the controls. Hold on, Kale said, his voice steady despite the chaos outside. The ship lurched as it lifted off, narrowly avoiding another blast. Elliot gripped the armrests, his mind racing. He had thought the key was the end of his involvement, but now he realized it was only the beginning. The transport ship shot into the sky, weaving through bursts of energy fire from the Zorath ship above. Elliot clung to his seat, his knuckles white as Kale's precise maneuvers sent the craft jolting left and right. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, drowning out the sound of his own panicked breathing. Can this thing outrun them? Elliot shouted over the noise. Kale's glowing eyes flicked to him briefly. Not for long. We need to reach the jump point. Jump point? Elliot asked, his stomach twisting at the thought of what that might entail. Lasara, seated beside him, leaned closer. A spatial tear. It's how we escape planetary orbit undetected, but it's unstable. We'll need precise timing. Great, Elliot muttered. Just what I needed. More instability. The ship rocked as a near-miss explosion rattled the hull. Zorath let out a guttural growl from his position at the rear, his claws gripping the handrails for balance. They're gaining, he barked. If we don't lose them soon. Enough, Kale snapped, his voice cutting through the tension. Focus. Elliot glanced back through the viewport, his heart sinking as the Zorath ship loomed closer. It was massive, its dark hull bristling with weapons and glowing with an ominous red light. The sight of it made his skin crawl. What happens if they catch us? He asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Lasara's expression hardened. They'll take the key, and us. Neither outcome is survivable. Fantastic, Elliot muttered. Why did I ever agree to this? Kale's hands moved deftly over the controls, his focus unshakable. Because you knew what was at stake. The ship suddenly lurched upward, the force pressing Elliot back into his seat. Ahead, a shimmering rift appeared in the fabric of space, its edges crackling with energy. It looked like a wound in reality, both beautiful and terrifying. Brace yourselves, Kale warned. The Zorath ship unleashed another barrage of fire, but Kale's quick maneuvering kept them just ahead of the blasts. The transport shot toward the rift, the glow of the tear growing brighter with each passing second. Hold on, Kale shouted. The ship plunged into the rift, and for a moment, everything went silent. The world outside the viewport dissolved into a swirling vortex of light and shadow, and Elliot felt a strange weightlessness, as if the laws of physics had momentarily ceased to exist. Then, with a deafening crack, they emerged on the other side. The stars outside were unfamiliar, their arrangement unlike anything Elliot had seen before. The Zorath ship was nowhere in sight, and for the first time in what felt like hours, the cabin was quiet. Cale exhaled slowly, his hands relaxing on the controls. "We're clear. For now." Elliot unbuckled himself, his legs shaky as he stood. "Where are we?" "The safe zone," Lasara replied, though her tone suggested it was a temporary reprieve. "Far enough from Earth to avoid detection, but not for long." Elliot frowned. "And what happens now? Do we just keep running?" Cale turned in his seat, his glowing eyes meeting Elliot's. "No. Now we prepare for the next step." "And what exactly is the next step?" Elliot asked, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "You dragged me into this, made me rebuild that thing, and now we're being hunted by intergalactic warlords. I think I deserve some answers." Cale studied him for a moment before nodding. "You're right. You do." He gestured toward the secure compartment where the key rested. "The key is more than just a device. It's a bridge, a link between biological and quantum systems. With it, we can cure diseases, terraform planets, even reverse the effects of catastrophic events." Elliot's brow furrowed. But, Lasara interjected, "it can also amplify destruction on an unimaginable scale. In the wrong hands, it could wipe out entire civilizations." Elliot sank into a nearby seat, his head spinning. "So, what do we do? Hide it? Destroy it?" Cale shook his head. "Neither. The key must be activated, but only under controlled conditions. There's a place, an ancient sanctuary hidden deep in the Andralis Nebula. It's the only location where the key's power can be safely harnessed." "And let me guess," Elliot said dryly, "the Zorath Collective knows about this place too." Cale's silence was answer enough. The journey to the Andralis Nebula was fraught with tension. Every sensor ping, every flicker of the ship's systems, set Elliot's nerves on edge. The aliens, however, remained focused, their resolve unshaken despite the looming threat. As they approached the nebula, the ship's systems began to glitch. The swirling clouds of gas and energy outside seemed to interfere with their instruments, making navigation a challenge. "This place looks like a death trap," Elliot muttered, staring out the viewport. "It's meant to," Lasara said. "The sanctuary was designed to be nearly inaccessible. Only those with the knowledge and determination to find it can reach it." "Well, congratulations," Elliot said. "We're determined. But are we lucky?" Cale smirked faintly. "Luck has little to do with it." The ship dove into the nebula, its shields crackling as they absorbed the surrounding energy. Elliot gripped the armrest, his stomach churning as the craft weaved through the chaotic currents. Finally, a structure emerged from the swirling clouds, a massive, ancient station carved into the side of an asteroid. Its surface was covered in glowing runes, their light pulsing in time with the key's resonance. "We're here," Cale said, his voice tinged with relief. Elliot stared at the sanctuary, a mix of awe and dread washing over him. He had no idea what awaited them inside, but one thing was certain. There was no turning back. The transport ship docked with the sanctuary's outer platform, its landing gear clanking against the ancient metal. The glow of the runes intensified, casting an eerie light across the docking bay. Elliot hesitated at the airlock, his pulse quickening. "This place doesn't feel welcoming," he muttered. "It's not meant to," Lasara replied, her tone somber. "The sanctuary was built to test those who sought its power. Only the worthy can proceed." "Define worthy," Elliot said, his voice tinged with sarcasm. "Because I'm pretty sure I'm just a guy who fixes broken things." Cale stepped forward, the key cradled in his hands. "You're more than that, Dr. Holden. You've proven your resilience and ingenuity. The sanctuary will recognize that." "Recognize it?" Elliot asked, his skepticism growing. "It's a building, not a person." Cale didn't respond. Instead, he activated the airlock, and the doors hissed open to reveal a long corridor lined with glowing symbols. The air inside was heavy, almost electric, and Elliot felt a strange pull, as if the sanctuary itself was aware of their presence. Zorath led the way, his claws clicking against the metal floor. Lasara followed, her silver eyes scanning their surroundings with caution. Elliot trailed behind, his every instinct screaming at him to turn back. Kale brought up the rear, the key's faint hum echoing in the silence. As they moved deeper into the sanctuary, the corridor widened into a vast chamber. Pillars rose to the ceiling, each etched with runes that seemed to shift and shimmer. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, its surface glowing with the same energy as the key. "This is it," Kale said, his voice reverent. "The activation point." Elliot frowned. "That's it? No traps? No tests?" As if in response, the runes on the pillars flared to life. The air grew colder, and a deep, resonant voice echoed through the chamber. "Who dares awaken the key?" Elliot froze, his heart hammering in his chest. Did that just come from the walls? Lasara stepped forward, her posture respectful. "We seek to restore balance. The key must be activated to heal what has been broken." The voice rumbled again, shaking the ground beneath their feet. "Balance comes at a price. Are you prepared to pay it?" Kale glanced at the others before stepping toward the pedestal. "We are." The voice fell silent, and the room grew still. Then, with a sudden burst of light, the pedestal emitted a beam that enveloped the key. The device began to glow, its intricate patterns shifting as it resonated with the sanctuary's energy. Elliot shielded his eyes, the intensity of the light almost blinding. "What's happening?" "The key is aligning," Lasara said, her voice filled with awe. "It's preparing for activation." Before anyone could respond, the chamber trembled violently. The light from the key flickered, and a sharp, mechanical screech echoed through the sanctuary. "They found us," Zorath growled, his claws flexing. "The Zorath are here." The Zorath soldiers breached the sanctuary's outer walls with terrifying precision. Their armor gleamed under the flickering light of the runes, and their weapons hummed with lethal energy. Elliot's breath caught as he saw their numbers, dozens of them, advancing like a wave of shadows. Kale moved quickly, drawing a weapon from his belt. "Protect the key at all costs." Zorath roared and charged into the fray, his sheer strength and ferocity making him a one-man army. Lasara activated a shimmering shield, deflecting incoming fire as she moved to cover Kale. Elliot, meanwhile, ducked behind a pillar, his mind racing. He wasn't a fighter. He didn't belong in the middle of a battle. But as he glanced at the key, still glowing on the pedestal, he realized he couldn't just stand by. "Lasara!" he shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "What happens if the key gets interrupted?" She glanced at him, her expression grim. "If the alignment is broken, the key could destabilize. The resulting explosion would destroy everything within a 100-mile radius." Elliot's stomach dropped. Great. No pressure. As the battle raged on, he spotted a group of Zorath soldiers moving toward the pedestal. His heart pounded as he realized their intent. They were going to take the key. Without thinking, Elliot grabbed a piece of debris and hurled it at the soldiers. It wasn't much, but it caught their attention long enough for Zorath to intercept them. The alien warrior tore through their ranks, his roars echoing through the chamber. Kale, meanwhile, focused on the key, his hands moving over the device with practiced precision. "I need more time," he shouted. "You don't have it," Zorath bellowed, fending off another wave of attackers. Elliot scrambled toward the pedestal, his instincts kicking in. He didn't understand the key's full mechanics, but he recognized some of the patterns Kale was working with. "What do you need?" he asked, sliding into place beside him. Kale didn't hesitate. "Stabilize the left matrix. It's losing alignment." Elliot's hands moved automatically, his years of engineering experience taking over. The patterns on the key shifted under his touch, and he felt a strange connection to the device, as if it recognized his intent. "Got it," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. Kale nodded, his focus unbroken. "Good. Now hold it steady." The chamber trembled again, and the light from the key grew brighter. Elliot could feel the energy radiating from it, a mix of power and potential that sent shivers down his spine. "We're almost there," Kale said. Just a little longer. The Zorath forces pressed harder, their determination evident as they pushed closer to the pedestal. Lasara's shield flickered under the relentless assault, and Koratha's movements began to slow, his strength waning under the constant barrage. "We can't hold them off much longer," Lasara shouted, her voice strained. Elliot's hands worked frantically, his focus locked on the key. The patterns on its surface shifted faster now, the energy within it building to a crescendo. He glanced at Kale, whose glowing eyes reflected the light of the device. "What happens when it's activated?" Elliot asked, his voice tight with urgency. Kale didn't look up. "The sanctuary will channel the key's power, creating a protective field around it. But we'll need to get out before it locks down." "Locks down?" Elliot repeated, his stomach sinking. "You're saying this place is going to seal itself off?" Kale nodded. "Permanently. The key's power must remain contained." Elliot's mind raced. They had fought so hard to protect the key, but now it seemed they would have to leave it behind. The thought was both a relief and a burden. "Fine," he said, his voice firm. "Let's finish this." The final moments were a blur. The key's glow intensified, filling the chamber with blinding light. The Zorath forces hesitated, their advance faltering as the energy around the pedestal became almost tangible. "It's ready," Kale shouted. "Get to the ship." Lasara and Korath moved quickly, covering Elliot and Kale as they sprinted toward the exit. The sanctuary trembled violently, the runes on its walls pulsing with energy. The Zorath soldiers, realizing their defeat, began to retreat, their dark forms disappearing into the shadows. As they reached the docking bay, the transport ship's engines roared to life. Kale ushered them aboard, his movements swift and precise. Elliot stumbled into his seat, his chest heaving as adrenaline coursed through his veins. "Is it done?" he asked, his voice shaky. Kale nodded, his expression solemn. "The key is secure. The sanctuary will protect it." Elliot exhaled, relief washing over him. But as the ship lifted off, he couldn't shake the feeling that their journey was far from over. The transport emerged from the nebula, the stars outside once again unfamiliar. The Zorath ship was gone, and the silence of space felt almost surreal after the chaos of the sanctuary. Elliot leaned back in his seat, his mind racing. "So, what now?" Kale turned to him, his glowing eyes thoughtful. "Now, we ensure the key remains hidden. The Zorath will not stop searching for it, but they won't find it here." "And Earth?" Elliot asked. "What happens to my home?" Lasara stepped forward, her silver eyes softening. "Earth will recover, thanks to you. The knowledge you've gained, the resilience you've shown. It will inspire others to protect what matters." Elliot scoffed lightly. "I'm just a guy who got dragged into this mess." Kale placed a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm. "You're more than that, Dr. Holden. You're a part of something much larger now." Elliot met his gaze, a mixture of exhaustion and determination in his eyes. "Guess I don't have much of a choice, do I?" Kale smiled faintly. "No, but you do have a purpose." As the transport set a course for a distant star system, Elliot stared out the viewport, his thoughts drifting. He had started this journey as a retired scientist, a man searching for meaning in a world that seemed to have left him behind. Now, he was part of a fight that spanned galaxies, a struggle to protect not just Earth, but countless other worlds. The key was secure, for now, but Elliot knew the battle wasn't over. The Zorath would return, and other threats would emerge. Yet, for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of purpose, a reason to keep moving forward. As the stars streaked past, Elliot allowed himself a small smile. He didn't know what the future held, but he was ready to face it. Together, they had protected the key, and together, they would protect the galaxy.